Well, this gets at something that we were talking about off the top of the show about the concept of servant leadership, and I read that quotation from uh, our prime minister, which you were just paraphrasing, and it sort of begs the question: why would a political leader be in opposition or be an adversary of his own people? That seems to be upside down. That seems to be a perversion, right? And so here's your understanding of leadership. You've spent many years in politics. Your concept of leadership is very different from that of the prime minister's. But unfortunately, and I want to get your take on this, it seems as though we have too much of his brand of leadership in our country, a sort of, talk to the hand, do as I say, not as I do, just trust us, we're the experts, um, as opposed to the kind of servant leadership that you dedicated your political life to. Would you agree with that? And that's the first part of the question. And how do we fix that? How do we change this picture so we don't have political leaders like Justin Trudeau, who are so frightened to be seen in public that he has a massive armed security detail? How do we get back to a situation like Jean Chrétien 30 years ago when he's kind of bullying his way through a crowd? It seems as though things are upside down right now. Do you have some ideas about this, or what are your thoughts
So
about this point?
I think this is where it takes a lot more discussion. But let me frame it up like this: uh, there's very, very few people in elected office or in the public who know how our representative democracy is actually designed and how it's intended to function. And that
Interesting.
largely, I'm applying that to, well, it's to everyone. The people in office don't even understand how the system is designed, other than in a very basic or very elementary style. And as a lawyer, I'll frame it this way to you, Leighton. In the courts, the courts are there to mediate and remedy, generally speaking, private disputes.
Right.
Parliament is a court as well. We have all
Interesting.
the functions of a court, and that court is to remedy and mediate public disagreements. Okay, and we do
Interesting.
that through a legislative process,
Hmm.
which is much just like an order of the court. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it's so if we think of it like that, um, and but our elected members and our don't understand that their purpose is actually as a mediator of public discourse and a mediator of public opposition. You know, whenever you're going to have a society, there are going to be various perspectives, and they have
Hmm.
to be uh, reviewed. They have to be debated, discussed, and find the best course forward. So,
Hmm.
but these days we get leaders who have, nobody's going to confuse Justin Trudeau with an intellectual capacity or even a uh, or
He
even
might.
or even empathy. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I would say that goes for most of our political leaders, are selected by the behind the scenes people in the party for their how amenable they will be to be manipulated, and how how little intellectual curiosity they may have and be easily led astray. Um,
Hmm.
so I say that in a very generic term. Obviously, there's exceptions to every rule,
Right.
but in my experience of 15 years in elected office, um, uh, politicians don't know what their job is, and corresponding to that is most of the electorate have no idea how the system works, and they think that you can go to the ballot box once every 4 years and get yourself a good government. And I often say to people, you wouldn't plant seeds in a garden and come back 4 years later and expect to harvest a big bounty. Um, it needs daily tending to um, an oversight. You got to
Hmm.
pull out the weeds. You got to do some pruning. You got to thin some of the carrots, um, and but most people in our society have been very willing to abdicate any role. Most of them have also abdicate their role once every 4 years, but just
Yeah.
about everybody has abdicated their role to do anything but cast a ballot.
Right. Right. And just sort of extrapolate that idea out. As part of that, you also see a problem in terms of the way political parties operate. And that is, they operate almost in an anti-democratic way. Do you want to explain that concept a little bit?
So our political parties have been captured. Um, just most people will most of our country, however you look at it, has been captured in electoral office and whatnot. We often use the term regulatory capture, but capture is capture, and our medical profession, for example, has been captured by big pharma, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, you could uh, look at this in many ways, but our democracy, or what we our elected democracy, has been captured by our political parties. People think that there's only one of two choices, or maybe three. You're either going to choose the orange team, the blue team, or the red team without thinking what those colors represent, what values they represent. It's just sort of a brand loyalty. But within each of those political colors, those political brands, they are indeed captured as well. And I often, yeah, I saw this growth very much so in my 15 years in office, where the political parties are captured by the corporate interests. They're captured by the
Hmm.
moneyed interests. And
Hmm.
one of my first caucus discussions, or through the first couple of caucus discussions, I realized that all of our discussions were not centered around how this legislation will benefit or be negative to the public. All our discussions were about how will the party benefit, or how will the party not benefit from whatever position we took on a public policy or a piece of
Hmm.
legislation. And and it became very evident that how the actual legislative process goes, in all our parliament, it is unlawful for an elected member to advance legislation for money. Okay, that's
Hmm.
completely taboo. But it's done.
Hmm.
Every piece of legislation that is advanced comes with a big dollar donor behind it,
Hmm.
and it doesn't matter if it's a bill for the pharmacists, a bill for the HR professionals, a bill for the forestry workers. Whoever you look at, I would say about 99.9% of legislation that I saw in the Ontario legislature came with big money behind it. I got myself in lots of trouble over this. It ended up leaving the party as a result of my continual exposure of how money advanced
Hmm.
legislation in Queen's
And
Park.
and then as an independent, without the sort of protection of the party, you were exposed to essentially to vilification, ostracization, and ultimately you're even charged criminally for some of the things that you said.
Yeah.
Um, and then so that sort of segues into some of the legal challenges that you've been fighting. You've actually brought a really significant, I think, charter challenge. I was reading about this. Do you want to talk about your charter challenge and the status of it right now?
Um, well, I've had a couple constitutional battles. One was against the prohibition on independent members raising money for their reelection, and I won that
Hmm.
one. Had the legislation change on this. Uh, the one that's currently on the docket and is in appeal is, essentially, without getting into a lot of details, but that the
It was on the Cornwall lockdown protest, right?
it's all, yeah, where they had a complete prohibition on peaceful assembly. Um,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
no, you were allowed at that time to go to Costco and Walmart. There were certain exemptions from the law, but otherwise, you were not allowed to leave your house
Hmm.
unless you met one of these uh, certain number of criteria. Um, and we held many rallies during that period of time. So far, that's still underway. But our courts have uh, given great deference to the the weight of the government's decision on this. I think a number of the constitutional arguments were faulty, not just on my case, but on many where we conceded the pandemic grounds. First off,
Yes.
Leighton, I think
Yeah.
looking at this objectively, there should have been a much greater uh, uh, discussion and a much greater desire by many people in the legal industry to attack the very notion
I
that there.
quite agree.
Yeah.
Quite agree. Yeah.
But that's water under the bridge now. I've also got the criminal charges, and
Mm.
just as our political parties are captured, I also believe much of the legal system has been captured as well. Uh, just like I uh, dispensed with my political party and my political affiliations in Queen's Park, I've dispensed with my legal counsel on the criminal charges and have decided to represent myself independently by myself. And I find that far more liberating, and that gives me far greater latitude to use the tools available to me to expose the corruption within our legal system, just
Hmm.
as I was doing exposing the corruption within our political system.
Hmm. You talk about the our justice system, and as with many of our cherished institutions in Canada, I would include in that, our churches, our schools, universities, legal profession, medical profession, and of course, political structures. There's been across the board a loss of public confidence in them. We don't have the same level of trust that we once had in these institutions. And it's
Thank God.
very, yeah, it's very difficult to be a functioning society when you can't have basic trust in those institutions. One example right now, of course, is in our courts. The Supreme Court of Canada has exercised jurisdiction to not hear any COVID case, not one, swept aside all of them, even ones that have affected millions of Canadians, and in fact, affected every single Canadian, some even the unborn. And then yet we get decisions where judges are referring to a woman and saying that no, we can't use that term anymore. Now we have the proper term is person with a vagina.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that I talk a lot about on our show is this concept of judicial activism, where we actually have these unelected elites appointed for life, and to a large degree, in a real sense, they're the most powerful people and the most unassailable lawmakers in the entire country. And I think that's a serious problem. I don't think we can have a democratic country, a free and democratic society, where we're ruled by judges. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's all our institutions have been captured, and you know, um, I first realized this again back in the electoral office when I realized that the integrity commissioner for the province wasn't there to find fault or to find a determination of right or wrong or good or bad, um, and to find a just outcome. The role of the integrity commissioner is to protect the facade, protect the institution of democracy. That's
Right.
what it is there. It's to make sure that the public retains its trust in the institutions. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say that, but the integrity commissioner's office is captured by that very thought. There's no longer any integrity within the integrity commissioner's office, and we've seen
Mm-hmm.
that very often with the many cases where Trudeau has run afoul of the integrity commissioner, and he gets $100 fine or a $200 ticket. Something like a major parking ticket for an outrageous a violation of ethics. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, but our courts as well, I believe, have been captured and even the and again, I'm speaking in very general terms here, and we should always realize that there are exceptions to every rule. But
Right.
the criminal defense lawyer who wants to move up the ladder and become a judge, or has multiple cases, he's captured by the crown, and he's captured by that whole environment. If that person wants to move up the hierarchy, um,
Mm-hmm.
so they and so they and the judges, they are captured as well, and all most of this comes back to the lack of public participation and involvement
Right.
in our society. And we have delegated, individuals have delegated ever more responsibility to the institutions and to the government, and have lessened their own role and impact. So,
Mm-hmm.
now these institutions become self-serving instead of serving to the public.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
like these judges, you know these outrageous statements, like the person with a vagina. Like,
Mm-hmm.
in my father's time, in my mother's time, had anybody stated that, there would have been an outpouring on the Supreme Court lawns of, how dare they
Right.
do something like this. But people have become, well, as I believe, people don't know how the system works. They don't know what their role in it, and they've abdicated their responsibilities
Mm-hmm.
to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Um,
and I would say, I don't want to sound, they've been encouraged to do so as well.
yes. Yes. Well, obviously, there's been hyperabundance of apathy, and I think an overabundance of tolerance too. But I'm interested to get your take on this. In recent polls, and I'm sure you've been watching these, they show that if we had an election today in Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada would win a massive majority. That the Liberals are actually below the block in popularity and just nosing ahead of the NDP. We could argue about whether the Liberals and the NDP are actually separate parties at this point, but Pierre Poilievre is really riding this wave of really people have had enough of Trudeau, and part of this wave that he's surfing is this whole platform about the carbon tax. But I saw on your X page you said something very interesting about the carbon tax and about Mr. Poilievre's stance on it. I'm just going to quote this. You asked a really good question. You said, why won't Pierre Poilievre put his money where his mouth is on the carbon tax? You say he could easily call for a constitutional amendment and remove his jurisdiction from the federal government with the support of the 7 provinces. You say, hell, any of the 7 premiers could initiate the process, but none of them will. They're just playing the voters for fools. And I would add on to that, he goes through this whole exercise of the non-confidence vote, which he knows is going to fail because he hasn't taken the time to work any sort of coalition to get the votes he would need on the floor in the House of Commons. So why is he doing this? Why is he playing the voters for fools? What's your thought on that?
Well, because he knows he's going to be the next prime minister. So,
Mm-hmm.
at the next election, there's 2 things that you can take to the bank, Leighton. One is everything will change, and nothing will change. So
Right.
the political parties will change, but nothing will change. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The colors will be reversed. Yes, if Pierre Poilievre actually knew what his role was as a leader of the opposition, he would be courting and orchestrating and uh, uh, alliances with the NDP. They would find some place where they could have agreement on something, um, or with the Bloc Québécois or whatever. And you know that's the way our parliamentary system worked before. Like
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, most people may not remember this, but Winston Churchill ran a union government during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
He had liberals. He was a conservative prime minister, but he had liberal cabinet ministers in it, and
Right.
Labor. Um, the last time we had a union government, it was in World War One with Sir Robert Borden. But this was the art of compromise, the art of doing what um, uh, it appears to be impossible. But all these guys are doing, our politics has become very cheap theater. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, Polyev and Trudeau are the leading stars in this episode of political theater. But what people don't realize is all uh, the behind the scenes, the screenwriters and the screenplay writers and the producers and the directors. These are the lobbyists, the GR men, the pollsters, the money men who orchestrate things, and they've purposely uh, have ensured that stupid people become leaders of political parties. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't like to use that term because I'm sure Pierre isn't stupid, but he's absolutely ignorant of politics, other
Right.
than the
He's not.
theatrics.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's not a free thinker. He's not an independent thinker. You
Yeah.
used the example of Churchill. He might be the ultimate example of someone who keeps his own counsel, but is also able to listen, which is something that our politicians today seem to have forgotten.